metal detecting out here. Metal detecting? Yeah. Old artifact, old coins, whatever. And I guess, yeah, Stella's seen and read and apply, but I told Laney, we got to run a PhD.
Oh, is that
It's
over?
public property.
You mean at the fairground?
Yeah.
They do it at the, East Side Park all the time. I don't think you asked if they moved it.
Yeah, my wife's, or my daughter's, father-in-law is a metal detector all over the world. He found a coin over in, Ireland for $750,000.
Oh, jeez. That'd be nice to find.
You didn't have to buy 100 lottery tickets to do it.
Mr. Houston.
Commissioners, it appears Mr. Hilton will be with us today.
He's
Dan-
on his way.
Oh, is he on his way? Okay, fair enough. Then I stand corrected. Where's, there we go.
Speak of the devil.
Where's Hubbard?
Hmm?
You're not Hubbard. I know who you are. Oh, but Ben's, come on, come on. What we're going to chat about here today is, last week, the Department of Ecology has changed their approach in terms of the closed basins in WRIA 48. And they haven't mended the rule, they haven't changed the rule, they haven't changed the interpretation of the rule. What they have done is reevaluated their ability to determine hydraulic connectivity. So we're in 173.548.050, which closes certain of the surface waters in the Methow. Of course, in 1991, they expanded that to include groundwater in connectivity with closed surface water. In past, the Department of Ecology, in those, we'll call them restricted, I want you to pull up one of the pictures when you get a chance there. And in what we've come to call the restricted areas of the closed basins, in past, they were allowing what they always referred to as bedrock wells. So if you drilled the bedrock and cased it to the bottom of the well, you were in hydraulic continuity. Now, on the maps, they also had areas where they presumed in hydraulic continuity, and they didn't require that type of well construction. So, what they've now decided is in those restricted areas, they can't tell. So, moral to the story.
They can't tell that the water's in connectivity.
They are saying they have questioned their methodology. Their statement at this point, they cannot determine. Now, when I say restricted areas, where's that pointer thing?
Then let's put them wide open for litigation.
Oh, it gets better.
Oh,
The door you think is opening is pretty much had the whole wall blown out. But they came with some duct tape.
Anyway. So, they can't tell. What, sorting through some of this, but this is one of the areas where they did their review this year. And these are some of the things we're encountering in our review. And let me say that at this point. Dan's crew and mine went through all of the building permits that have not been issued. I have drawn an arbitrary line in terms of what we're going to review and what we're not, obviously subject to direction to the contrary. Any building permit that's out the door, we decided was vested in the past methodology, but we didn't look at it. Any building permit that was in the hopper but not out the door, we reviewed. And we didn't find, well, we found one, I guess, but they weren't doing anything. We didn't find any that fell in this new snare. We also looked at the site analysis that we had completed, but they had not applied for a building permit yet. And we didn't find any there that were caught up in this. So at least so far as what we have in the hopper, we're okay. But here's where it becomes somewhat problematic. They went through and they revisited Wolf Creek, they have revisited Thompson Creek, they have revisited Beaver Creek. So we have new maps. Now, they have said in those restricted areas, as with all the restricted areas, they can't tell. Those areas outside of the restricted areas, they say they're going to stand by the determination they're not in hydraulic continuity. I do not have that in writing at this point. Now, their assertion was the reports that we received said that. With due respect, I don't know. They're pretty wishy-washy in terms of the narrative surrounding that decision. So I've asked for a letter with greater clarity. But this is an example. The yellow there was one. Now, in this particular case, it's actually a water system on a water. Correct me if I'm wrong, this one?
No, that was the Gold Creek one.
Which one's this one then?
This one was
one.
one of our, the site analysis we had completed, but they hadn't ever applied for their building permit.
Okay, but it's down along the river. Where's the river?
Rivers, Perry, go up from the yellow, right there. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I actually
all
know
right.
that really well, right?
I've got this one now. We've looked at several here in the last few days. Wolf Creek has been reevaluated, so that line there is current. So we're out in the restricted area for Wolf Creek. Thompson Creek has been reevaluated, so it's outside of the restricted area for Thompson Creek. Patterson Lake, however, has not been reevaluated. Now, it is DOE's statement that in those areas where they haven't done their reevaluation, where they haven't revisited those 1991 maps, they don't believe they can tell in any part of the closed basin. In this particular case, because they evaluated Wolf and they evaluated Thompson, I've concluded they probably looked at Patterson too, and it's outside of all those restricted areas, so this one went through.
Yeah, there's no way that you could be in hydraulic continuity on the other side of a mountain.
Well, one would argue no, but why don't you go to Gold Creek? What we're gonna run into in the interim, their statement to me was, in those areas where they haven't done their review, we should just wait until they finish those.
What prompted all of this?
Well, this has been an ongoing debate for actually quite some time. And some hydrologists, we have actually talked to, claim there is no such thing as a bedrock well. That's not hydraulic continuity with something. So their idea that is if you go to the bedrock and seal it, the water's still coming from somewhere. And now what the Department of Ecology is saying, we don't know if it's coming from the closed surface water or not. So they're just not gonna say. Now, this is one of the areas where it has not yet been reevaluated. So as you can see, you have your restricted areas, you have your non-restricted areas.
This is the old map, though.
It's the old map. That's down along the river. They are telling us that we should hold off on everything until they do the evaluation.
It's a lot of parcels to hold off on.
Pardon?
I said, when you look at that right there,
There's
that's a lot of parcels.
There's a fair amount of activity. Now, in all of the studies, a lot of the studies that I've looked at, they give reference to the main valley aquifer.
Mhm.
So, what we're talking about here today is essentially how much you want I and my crew to do the Department of Ecology's job in the interim. Down on the main stems, they don't map it, they just discuss it, they talk about it. The main valley aquifer. Probably not in hydraulic continuity with any of the closed surface waters. DOE has not told me that. We can consider that in our evaluations. We asked Dave here in some of those closed areas, going back to the restricted areas, they're either not gonna build, or they're gonna build dry cabins, or they're gonna come up with some kind of alternate water supply, and I don't know what public health spin is on those sorts of things at this point, but
Historically, over several decades, we have not accepted the use of cisterns or holding tanks as a dependable source of water, just based on the weather conditions in Okanogan County. There's no guarantee a lot of times during the winter months that you can get a water truck to some of these places, a lot of these places, actually. So, like I said, historically, we have not accepted the tanks and cisterns as fulfilling the requirement for water adequacy. And that's where we're at today.
Just based on the fact that you, you didn't feel that you could actually get water to the residents.
Correct.
Was there a volume of water that was being considered for that? Was it like a cistern? That you're trying to, a supply you're trying to maintain?
We never have, because we didn't, since we weren't going to allow them for anything other than recreational or temporary use, 60 days up maximum per year type of stuff. We never really established. I know for a building permit purposes, you could get building sign off from our office at a quarter gallon a minute or 360 gallons per day. So, I mean, I guess if we were to ask what would we project, well, telling this common drilled well homeowner that they need at least 360 gallons per day.
Yeah, and so the reason I asked that question was because if you're making a decision whether you can get the water there would really be relevant to how much water you're trying to keep there. And I've done it.
Yeah, if you got 10,000 gallons at 350 gallons a day, is 28, 29 days.
Almost a month.
Yeah.
10,000 gallon cistern. Cistern.
Well, if you're hauling your water there,
Really?
you're probably gonna be
How much-
conservative and not
a water
use
truck,
350
a
gallons
water
a
truck
day.
holds,
Exactly.
or like a tanker truck holds 8,000, doesn't it?
Depends on the size of the tanker.
That's 64,000 pounds.
Yeah. So, you know,
I hauled in a 500-gallon tank.
So there's a couple of questions that come to mind. This rule was written in 1976, again, based on surface water diversions. The assumption, I guess, was that this water was either adjudicated or there were rights to the water that would cause ecology to close the surface water. So what happens when the rights are given up? Like, that they lost their water rights. So these don't have in-stream flows on them. It was just the surface water that was closed to further allocations.
right.
The 2 CFS reservation was done in 1976, so it's dated 76.
Right.
So if you have less water now than was allocated in 1976, they're going to allocate water.
That's up every once in a while. We actually Ted did an analysis of the land acquisitions and the water rights associated with that, which presumably at that point went to in-stream flow, and it was not an inconsequential amount of water.
What did we figure, 0.2, or what did Porville have up there? 0.25 acre? Or 25 acre feet? And we figured out a year-round use, that was like 89 houses,
For,
domestic use.
yeah, it depends on what you're using for it, daily use.
Right.
When you're in a city water system, you can account for the water. And you're paying for it, and it changes how you look at use.
I mean, to my knowledge, there's been no real effort to reconcile the surface water rights that have been either dedicated to in-stream flow or in some other manner given up. with the TCFS reserve or any kind of tie back to a water budget of any sort. There was that relatively brief discussion, at least that I was part of, going, when we were talking about moving the water around to try to smooth the high top. I was trying to evaluate what water rights in these closed surface waters have been given up or otherwise dedicated back to the creek. I don't know if that's been done.
Well, it's not often that, I don't think it's often that you relinquish water involuntarily and nobody does anything. I mean.
Yeah, it doesn't go to trust, it doesn't do anything, it's a relinquishment.
Yeah, it's a relinquishment, but the deal is that oftentimes the relinquishment is discovered until somebody applies to do something with the water.
Right.
When the discussion had a finer point on it in years past, the response from the Department of Ecology was fairly consistently, when water is given up, goes back to in-stream flow, however you want to say it, essentially all it does is help the senior water right holders to get their full allotment. So it's not reappropriated per se, which of course the law actually allows.
There wasn't that much effort put into the accounting system.
Not a great deal, no, that's accurate. So essentially, anything given up down here, the assumption is it helps the folks with a more senior water right get what they're supposed to get anyway, so. I don't have my documentation from DOE yet, I asked for it. We have 3 basins that have been evaluated, again, they're Wolf, Thompson, and Beaver Creek, so theoretically, based upon the phone conversation we had, we can operate pretty much as we have, except restricted areas. If I'm interpreting the Department of Ecology's conversation correctly, there will simply be no new permit exempt wells in those restricted areas. And this, whether, we got a couple of things still to sort through. We went through all the permits in the hopper, and we, so far those are all okay. However, we haven't gone through and evaluated the water availability decisions, or I don't think we have yet, no. The water availability decisions that we made during the Title 20 days to see how many of those might fall in either the gray area in those basins where they haven't done the reevaluation, or in the restricted areas, even where they have. Because the Department of Ecology's statement was they're not prepared to honor, if you will, the decisions they made to date if the water has been put to beneficial use. So if you have a well constructed in one of the restricted areas, even though you have the letter from the Department of Ecology saying you're not in hydraulic continuity, they're not going to stand by. Now, I don't know how many wells we have up there in those areas with that letter, but have not yet been put to beneficial use yet. I don't know.
So now do you start taking cues from Chelan County and figuring out mitigation efforts in small tributaries? That was part of their new watershed plan.
Certainly something to explore. I think it gives rise to the question if that would require an amendment to the rule. Because the rule simply closed any further appropriations.
Yeah, but,
Whether you could argue an appropriation mitigated in some way is okay. We went through this discussion this the other day.
Just a little more. Okay, thanks.
So Perry, on those areas that have been reevaluated and identified, then those are construed as closed to all further appropriations?
In the restricted areas where they, yeah, they're, I mean, I suppose it's theoretically possible if you could obtain a water right and move it around up in those
Right.
closed tributaries, I mean, I don't know what the
Yeah.
odds of that are,
Not
but
like winning Powerball or
fair
something.
enough, it's at least
Up there,
theoretically
you're not,
possible.
I doubt you're gonna get anybody to start selling
Just a little more.
water rights.
Beaver Creek, yeah, okay.
See, okay, now here, now, but here's the title of 173-548-050. Streams and lake closed to further consumptive appropriations. So if you can mitigate for the water use, you are not consumptively using water.
One could make that argument.
How you gonna do that?
Well, I know that there's projects out there where artificial beaver dams, there are ways, I mean, I don't know them all, but I know that there are, other counties looking,
So they would count storage
they count storage.
Account storage now,
Yes.
that's.
And they are quantifying.
as medication?
Yeah,
Yeah, because they've held the water back for future use during the year.
Okay.
After they've already come through here and required removal of all dams that weren't engineered, now they're telling us that, well, if those dams were there, we'd have more water available later.
I mean, one of the interesting twists the conversation the other day took was, this goes back to Posted Mill, where you're dealing with, you know, all of the surface water is closed. They didn't set a flow and anything below that. Obviously, it's verboten, anything above that is still available for further appropriation, is all closed. So even during high water flow, low water flow, medium water flow, it's all still closed surface water and not available for appropriation. So whether you storing for use during low water times, you might well run afoul of the argument that it's still water in whatever Wolf Creek, and as such closed to further appropriation. I'm anticipating some kind of written instrument from the Department of Ecology laying all of this out in more detail,
Something beyond draft form.
if you will, you know, or, well, phone conversation at this point is what we're working off of. How adventurous do you want us to get, commissioners? I mean, we can take into account the main valley aquifer, and make decisions there. We can, DOE's suggestion was we wait in those areas that, haven't been revised.
Right. But the non-enclosed areas, they don't have any guidance aside from business as usual?
At this point, their only guidance was until they revised the maps. They're not going to be able to tell there either.
How many landowners are affected?
I don't know. In terms of
In those
people,
areas that are now redelineated and closed.
in terms of people in the hopper, none. We did that evaluation. In terms of the number of parcels, we actually have that information. There's a fair number of undeveloped parcels still in those areas.
They didn't give you any time on it when they would have this new strategy.
They thought they were working on Gold
Well-
Creek now.
They just called me at lunch here, I gotta call them back and try and set up a meeting within the next 2 weeks. So, I don't know.
They got Thompson, Beaver, and Wolf done the latter part of last year, first part of this year.
Mhm.
So I mean, it's gonna be a multiple year
Yeah.
process. There's what we figure out, there's 15, 17 closed surface
Mhm.
tributaries and 19 lakes, or 15 closed tributaries and 17 lakes, I don't remember which now, but.
1, 2,
I don't remember that many.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 streams, but they say Davis Lake includes streams. So, you know, 15 streams and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 17 lakes. A lot of those lakes are way, way up high.
So,
Yeah, a lot of our development proposals, and when I say development proposals, I'm talking building permits, we haven't had too many short plats. We haven't had any larger subdivision proposals, all been short plat, generally 2, 3. I think we've had 1 4 lot, memory serves right. Some of them on existing wells, some of them were just splitting residential structures and things like that. So we haven't had a lot of subdivision activity, but we do have the building permit. We did the evaluation before in terms of those that were on a water system that was mitigated by the surrender of the water right. They're not actually on a certificate of water right, but they gave up irrigation water to mitigate their water system. Department of Ecology didn't say they weren't going to honor that at this point, because they were involved in it in order for them to do. They have the documentation from the Department of Ecology that recognizes them surrendering that water to get their water system.
so they sound like they're gonna, would honor approvals within the non-closed areas.
Well, they didn't say that. They didn't say they weren't going to.
They said that, well,
I mean,
Perry disagrees with it, I don't, I mean, you would have to definitely read it, be a lawyer to say, yes, this says you can do that, which I don't think it does, I think Perry's correct, but they said, we've done research in these basins, and we've said that the portion outside of this restricted area is not hydraulically connected to it.
and I guess let's go ahead and chat about that a bit more. Wolf Creek, for instance, went down through the report, and while they certainly imply, if not state that, they also include a deal of language about still a certain level of requirement for site-specific evaluation. There's the catch-22. They open the door to a site-specific evaluation, which the rule says they have to do. But they don't want to do that in those areas where they had revised their maps. So they're almost, you know, pincher movement of their own creation, which is why I want a letter from them saying in those areas where we revise the maps, anything outside of the restricted area is not in hydraulic continuity. That takes away that site-specific need, which we can do.
Well, that, I mean, clearly, what I wanna see is whatever they've decided, it is written, and we are looking at it, and not, providing guidance from now on out without that information based just on our conversation.
Which is where we're gravitating
Right.
to in the conversation. I mean, we got 3 basins where they've done the evaluation, and while they haven't stated with the specificity I'd like to get, they did say in a roundabout kind of way that it's not in hydraulic continuity. So at least we can point to their reports for that.
Yeah.
The other ones they haven't done.
Because, I mean, it's kind of difficult to go much beyond where we are today in this conversation without having something that is, you know, clearly or as clearly as they can state the rules.
I mean, in some respects, their timing isn't bad. We're slowly marching into the slow season for building permits, so, but it won't last very long.
And then, I'd like to explore this a little further on the cistern concept anyway, because, you know, there's a lot of folks out there that are talking about how much they need really for water per day, and I think some of those are being based on those kind of situations, even though some of them are being pumped into, you know, and they're holding tanks or day tanks.
Here's the kicker. The 2 public water systems that you could purchase buying water from them for a house would have to then count that against their system.
Against their connections.
Neither one of them want to do that, I'm sure. Okay. You can't buy water off of somebody's well because it would be the 2 CFS reservation and it would be water spread. So the only way that you could get cisterns to work up there is if somebody had a right and it was, if you could serve, water from, you could put water communities.
Single point, single connection.
Or you.
Well, you could use, I think that you can use a water right as in, I mean, you use the bottled water. So there's a commercial application.
But it'd be a single, I say single connection, because it's gonna go into somewhere where
Oh,
it's
yeah,
getting
right,
taken
right,
out.
right, yeah.
It's going to multiple locations,
Multiple
but it's
locations, but it's
just
single
one
connection.
point.
Correct.
Well, I'd like to look into it anyway, because it's not, this isn't the only place in the world. You know, we have the potential for that in the Okanogan. But I'm real curious about, you know, that particular policy. Because they're doing it in the Okanogan. They're buying water.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, yeah, they're doing it in Methow a lot too.
Yeah, I don't know where they're getting the water, but, I mean, if I was to carry, if I was to, you guys are talking tank, you're talking 4,000, 5,000 gallon, most will commonly 4, and it's much more used, I mean, you could be hauling your water from the Okanogan Valley.
Most of them are acquiring it through single,
Other-
individual
others,
water
yeah,
wells.
Which brings up the issue that Andy brought up, yeah.
See, this is, there's a document out there that is the actual predecessor to the rule. It's the report, the basin report. It says, of streams and lakes for further consumptive appropriation. As a result of an investigation of water availability, this was written in 1976, certain tributary streams listed in table 15, page 42, principal tributary streams, current and proposed status, will be closed to further consumptive appropriations during the period specified. It is further declared to be prejudicial to the public interest to allow further consumptive appropriations from certain streams listed in this table. Certain exceptions may be granted for domestic and normal stock watering uses during the periods from May 1st through October 31st, or as otherwise noted. There's a lot of things in here that talk about, you know, that domestic use, they could actually make some exclusions for it. I don't know that they're going to though.
Down along the main stems. Do you want us to argue that's the main valley aquifer and do that analysis? When someone comes in for a building permit, or you want us to hold off? I think we're in a holding pattern if you get much off the main stems.
Right, that's kind of where I was going with that. I mean, that's the approach I'd take, is that area that there's a bit of uncertainty and actually some implication that there might be, there's a lot of lots in that area. I mean, you know, I think that we should, whatever, even if it isn't clear, we want to clarify it, and if we can move forward with those, we should do that. The rest, we're gonna have to wait till they give us their policy and what rule it's based on, by the way.
Well, Benson Creek's closed, correct me if I'm wrong.
Benson
You're
Creek
right,
closed.
right there.
So, you know, there's a lot of distance between the restricted area and the river itself, so I'd be reluctant to get too adventurous.
Right.
If we get
well,
much off the main stem, but
even
down
if-
right on the main stem,
Yeah.
we could arguably justify an assertion that it's not in hydraulic continuity.
Well, and then we gotta find out what, you know, what they, They're not restricted areas, so let's find out. We can't sit around for a long period of time saying, well, we don't know on those areas that aren't even closed.
It does state in this thing too, in cases where there exists a major excess of flow over use during the spring and a potential storage site is available, the exception for waters developed solely for an increased storage capacity within the basin is included. So they're making an exception for spring storage.
In the rule, my concern is, and I think it goes back to post, I don't think that's an option. Because you're still arguing it's closed surface water. I would dearly love to be wrong, and not to sound like a jaded old bureaucrat, but I have a feeling that we might have a tough row to hoe with that one. If you had a minimum flow set beyond which you couldn't appropriate, and you were talking storage, so long as you can maintain the in-stream flow, you'd probably have a shot. But that's not what the rule says. The rule just closes it. High, low, in the middle.
Is that part of, you might know this, Sandy, is that, you see where Booth Canyon is right there in the middle of all that? So, I think that's Booth Canyon, that big, your left, no, the other side.
Yeah.
The west side
Yeah.
of where your hand is,
Yeah.
keep going left,
Yeah.
that big canyon right there.
Yeah. Is that Booth?
Yeah, I think it is.
Golden Doe?
Yeah. Golden Doe's up on the right of it.
Yep, that would probably be correct.
It's kind of interesting how that whole lay of land in Texas Creek aren't closed and, they're part of the rest of the basin. I'm kind of curious about that. That area doesn't look any more hydrated than anywhere else.
One land, remember, this was all based on surface water flows.
Right.
One landowner with one right out of that, to water just down around the bottom. They probably figured that there wasn't, and that's an assumption on my part,
I
because
have no idea.
that big giant piece of property's been owned by one person.
Right.
A very long time. So if
But
you're
there-
only,
So I'm picking, and I understand that, but it seems odd that you'd even consider that owns a piece of land or not, because we can subdivide the property, it's all part
remember,
of the
we're
game.
talking about 1976. In this thing, it
You
said.
weren't even born yet, right?
I was born in 1976, actually. Thank you.
So, but I'm also looking at other areas like that, so go up on the other side of that, the closed area on Alder Creek. So it breaks over a ridge right there, there's a lot of wells from right in there that aren't being used, that I've seen, just on that ridge and on that other side. So, that's why I'm saying, and there's properties there that have a well casing sticking in the ground, fully intended to be sold, I think, and then I see a couple of houses going up there, one in particular right now.
I mean, this is just based on my memory for what that's worth, but when we were doing the water availability process, they would always pull up the number of well logs in these particular basins, and when Gene did his analysis, I recall specifically, some of them, there was a considerable difference between the number of developed parcels versus well logs, and they closed them.
You're saying there was
There's-
more well logs than there were,
Then there were
Yeah.
developed parcels,
That's
so
what
we got some wells up there,
yeah,
that were drilled over the years.
yeah, these were drilled probably in the 70s.
That haven't been put to use. Now, those, I assume it'd be the desire of the commission to reflect as much of that to the Department of Ecology as we can, when people come in and want a building permit on a well that's already. If I discussion correctly, they're not going to stand by those past decisions. So, I mean, kind of clicking off the guidance we're looking for, obviously, old or new, the restricted areas, DOE's not gonna determine hydraulic connectivity, so they're off the table. so far as wells are, new or existing wells, as far as they're concerned. For the revised areas, outside of the restricted areas, while I don't have it in writing yet, it sounds like the Department of Ecology is prepared to support their assertion those areas are not in hydraulic connectivity. So we can move ahead with applications in those areas if the commissioners desire us to do so. Those areas in the not yet revised basins outside of the restricted areas, we can come off the main stems a little ways if the commissioners are interested in doing that, and then the rest of it, we're in a holding pattern until DOE finishes their revision.
This is the thing that's frustrating to me. Again, reading this report. In the glossary, closure, administrative measure to keep water resources from further appropriation to consumptive uses. Generally, domestic household use and normal stock watering are exempted when there is no practicable alternate source of supply. That is the definition in their glossary.
They, my opinion, they built a fair number of what one might call reasonable standards into the in-stream flow rule. And I mean, to a point, Department of Ecology is in the same crosshair, maybe more so than everybody else, with the whole series of court cases that have come along and have taken away, you know, any notion of restore or mitigating water. You know, it's all, the lines are coming much closer together and they're very big and bright. So I mean, to a point, I guess I get
Well, and
where they're going.
what Andy just read, would be applicable to lots that exist. I wouldn't think that you could.
No, I would agree.
Yeah.
I would fully agree with that. You couldn't subdivide anymore.
Right.
But,
If you had the piece of property there and it was all intent, for all intents and purposes, which it goes the other way for us that way too, because when we looked at for the overlay, that's exactly what we were looking at, how many lots in an area exist. They're making it look a little more difficult to even deal with pre-existing subdivisions.
they're just saying that they're not given a, you know, in the closed basins, we were relying on the letter from DOE to say, you need to construct your well properly, and then after the well was constructed, yes, you constructed your well properly. Well, they aren't gonna do that anymore.
In the closed basins we're looking at right just in the picture right now, clearly there's a lot less lots out there than there are in the areas that aren't closed. I mean, look at,
Some of the basins, well, there's, you know, like Benson Creek, for instance, you know, you got that line of pretty good size lots there along the edge that well,
along
we'll
the
have
stream, right?
challenges. I mean, they could still be in public ownership, there could be all sorts of different
Mhm.
things that
Oh,
make
yeah.
them not developable.
And those
Yeah,
lots that exist.
you know, your heaviest concentrations are down along the valley
Yeah.
floor, obviously, so.
Angie, will you move south on the map, please? Okay, well,
Now, French Creek is a different story.
move south just a little bit more, please. Where is? A little bit more. Okay, so there's the.
Yeah, you're looking at that area that's influenced by the Columbia.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I could say is that changes the amount of property that you could use under the TCFS reservation.
Just clip that number of lots down,
Well,
as a matter of fact. Hearing my summary of our decision tree, if you will, do the commissioners have any challenges with that approach?
What's gonna be your approach? I was sitting here reading this, trying to
Well,
figure
fair
out.
enough, that's the areas where the guys are mapped
Those are
are out. Those outside of the restricted areas, we can go ahead and assume, although, to your point, it'd be nice to have the letter from ecology, but at this point, they're saying, that their reports say they're not hydraulic connectivity. Those areas where they has the maps, the restricted areas are out. The areas outside of the restricted areas are out except for a modest distance on either side of the main stems. Let's see. Then everywhere else would be out. Although we're in a holding pattern until they finish their
So
revision.
can we get together a map that then shows that?
Well, we can try. Hubbard tried, we found that reference to the main valley aquifer over and over and over again. We have yet to find a map of that. So whether anything out
Right.
in the bottom of the bowl or what, so
Let's call it a preliminary map, something that we can take a glance at.
we can give it a shot and see if we find.
Approximation.
Nothing else, we have LiDAR for the main stems, maybe we can come up with a elevation survey or a level that we can argue,
It
draw a
must
map
have-
against.
It must have to do with the elevations, how close they get to the river versus where you would be hydraulic continuity with this closed surface water. You know, if something dumped in really rapidly, you'd be more in continuity with that stream than if something's flowing out through a delta
Right.
on river.
Well, that's why I was looking up there at Alder, the south end of Alder Creek. If you go back up there, where you were before I asked you to go. Yeah, right, so you see on that northwest or northeast line up, going up the valley, on the Alder right there. So you see where the creek is, she just had her hand on it. It pulls up out of there and then it breaks down the other side, right? It's fairly, it's relatively steep and it goes down that side. So where's the water coming from for all those lots, along that particular area? I use that just because I am more familiar with that part of Methow, but I get up in those areas and I go, well, where the heck, because Alder Creek's down over to the southwest of that. And so there's those higher lots, you were talking about elevation, they're up ways. How do you figure, where's the water come from those? I mean, they're drilling 200-300 feet wells, if that. How do you figure out that is in continuity with the main stem?
Well, there's probably
Creek's
some
way
parts,
closer to that.
there are probably some parcels up there where they don't find any water to be in connectivity with anything. But I know they had an awful time in that stuff up
Yeah.
above,
Huh.
what, Ben? No.
So I'm just looking at that, and I know there's a lot of places like that. It's kind of an interesting connection we're making here. But heck, if there's water up there, okay. I'm not gonna ask where it came from, I guess.
Outreach.
Talked to the watershed, or I talked to some members of the watershed council. They said they're willing to help us with outreach,
Okay.
start scheduling community meetings. Those are willing to attend that.
You're from Betchmanville.
Oh, good, yeah, yeah.
You know by name. I only know a few of them by name.
We'll see what their next, DOE's next, round of thoughts are, or whatever, as soon as I can figure out what dates they wanna meet.
Okay.
But it would be good to know when community meetings get scheduled, because it would behoove us to also, when we have opportunities, to go and see what the conversation's like.
Do we, any new ones that'll come through the door? Problematic site analysis?
Applications, not that I'm aware of.
I don't think, we don't have anybody hammering at the door right now. Right
Well,
there.
we are fortunate where we are.
I was saying,
Yeah, absolutely.
At the time of years, I assume the discussion of alternate water supplies will take place through the Board of Health
Yeah.
with your environmental health staff, or
Yes,
however you wish to.
I would advise our commissioners to take the issue up for discussion at the Board of Health. It's a tough crowd there.
Keep
Yeah.
in mind that that
PTSD being a
is
common.
really goes through my department, but we use them as the experts on
True,
it.
good
So
point.
Right, I mean, they
it
gotta.
really
they
is
gotta
our
approve it for,
decision, which would be your decision,
Right.
but we use them for their expertise on that, so.
but I would say if you had a, you know, if you had a lot that you knew you could get a fire engine to every day of the year, you could probably get water to it every day of the year.
Correct. So,
Road
roads,
standards are gonna be important.
very much so, and that's always been the issue, because we can monitor the fact that you've drilled a well and you've tested it. Cause we do it one time, we assume it's on you then to keep it up and operational. We can't guarantee in any way whatsoever as far as dependability factors go to keeping a tank filled, or where the source is. So,
Right.
That might be the harder part.
that's gonna be the issue, I think, getting it, if the decision was made that, well, they've had their right to the well drilling taken away based on ecology's decisions, what can we do to accommodate it in the event that cisterns or holding tanks were approved for use? I think their biggest headache is gonna be generated in an attempt to try and find a water source that they can actually haul that kind of volume out of.
Well, yeah, so a piece of land with a water right is allocated that water right based on what's being used on the land. So you darn near have to have a load ticket from the municipality that you bought the water from,
Exactly.
and those
And they don't wanna do that.
No way.
They don't wanna do that?
Why would
The
they give up-
towns don't wanna
No,
do
why would
that.
they give up their tax base?
Yeah.
They're doing it all. They're selling water right out of their tank, and they're selling it.
Well,
But for probably for, are they people that live within, I mean, think about the fact that you would be giving up the property tax value of a house within a municipality if you didn't serve them.
You mean,
I mean, let's say,
Oh,
like
no.
Winthrop has 90 connections left, okay? 90 houses
Yeah.
within the city limits give you that much more tax base.
no, I'm talking about current practices, and I don't think the towns that are doing it, and the ones too that I know that are doing it is, Warville and Tabasco. And,
But,
but I hear what you're saying.
but they have more water than they have
That's
lots
right.
to serve, I'm
That's right.
assuming, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so see, when there's no excess.
There's not, yeah, there's not that issue. I mean, if you talk to Twist, they're already buying the water, right? So it wouldn't behoove them to turn around and sell it, so you can take it back out of town. But no, but it's not a consideration for them, because I don't think it amounts to that much.
So are you talking about maybe that for the north end of the county, looking at cisterns?
Yeah,
Because they
look,
could
only-
do that?
Mainly because they're doing it now, so what you ended up with
Well,
is.
really, they are doing it.
You know, I can't ignore that fact, and
The main issue there is that most of those people do not have building permits or any of that, and that's how they can do that, or why they
Good
are
point.
doing that.
Good point. Yeah, so all this stuff kinda comes around to,
But
kinda
we,
interesting. But I've also said, you know, like for 9 Mile, up in the 9 Mile ranches, I mean, how many of those lots were created? And I don't know if those were exempt subdivisions.
or exempt, so-
Yeah, so how many were created and they don't have water? I mean, there's houses there that, probably no building permits, right? It's
Mhm.
pretty nice
Could
houses,
be,
probably.
yeah. Well,
And,
we permitted a bunch up there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but were they permitted prior to the time when we were really paying that close attention to the, 19, the statute that requires you to show water?
1927, we've
Yeah.
been doing that since day one, since I've been here,
Yeah.
20 years plus
Yeah, prior
before
to-
that.
Yeah, okay, because, those, I mean, some of those have wells, maybe they even went dry, because there wasn't that much water anyway. I mean, they were getting, what, a gallon a minute or 2 gallons a minute at some of those wells in there. I know those are some of the folks that are hauling out of Warville. You know, it's, and then you see, the ones that I really know are without permits are those ones with about 55-gallon drums in the back that they're filling up
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, as they drilled so many more of those new pivot wells, got out of the surface water withdrawals and went to the irrigation wells, you can fill a 5-gallon or a 5,000-gallon tank really quick now if you've got somebody that's got one of those pivots with a
Yeah.
disconnect and a pipe. Mhm.
So
Oh, hypothetically,
Hypothetically.
it's it.
of course.
Well known.
That's what I was just saying.
Rumor has it.
The amount of water that goes out through our pivots is equal to, is equal to the average household use, or 3 average household uses per day, every minute.
That's why it's fast to fill the truck.
Yeah. I don't know, I've never tried.
You know, weigh it out. What's it worth? Water, alfalfa?
Yeah.
So, commissioners, sound like you have a call in to get a meeting up.
I got
Department of
I have
Ecology,
to call
so.
them, yeah.
Kind of morph it with, Dan, observations, anything you'd throw in at this,
Well, the only thing,
Full
it looks
of
like
thoughts?
it isn't affecting us as a nation. Obviously, if it would have been that bad, that would change those numbers I gave you the other day. But going through it, when we only found one that was a possible problem, and it has been taken care of, you know, I don't know where it's gonna, I'm hoping it's not gonna make that big of a dent in us. Although if you can't approve anything that just right in those other areas, that could,
I'm gonna push on them to get them done.
Yeah.
Say this is, let's,
well, it's a big.
Well, question in that regard. The pre-existing home site, domestic use, single well, serving a single-family residence, they could still utilize the 2 connection waivers and hook to the same well, correct?
well.
On like an adjacent home site. They're not drilling, it's additional withdrawal.
We were doing that, under the banner of, it's an existing water use, they're still restricted to the 5,000 gallons a day, therefore. Some have suggested that's not in compliance with the
single domestic.
2 CFS reserve and the language of the rule. Although that said, if you use their argument of going back to the public health codes, they do have that discussion about farm, up to 4
Same farm, yeah,
connections or something
up to
like
same,
that.
4 of the same farm connections or 2 connection, 2 separate residences, 2 separate properties on a 2 connection waiver.
We haven't had those pop up too much of late, although we did have the one short plat that took a swerve where they were going to use an existing well. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe that wasn't your file. They were gonna use an your file, they were gonna use an existing, somebody's file. They were gonna use an existing well, and they changed their mind. We yarded that back and made them go back out.
Let me just put it this way, the noose is taken. Because everywhere you look, even though when you started out, even when this thing started out in 1976, it was really looking to make sure that domestic use was, you know, important. I mean, people's health and safety was important. Everything else was important too, but those were the primary. Closed, absolutely couldn't find water, domestic use is exempted. Now, doesn't matter anymore.
Well, and in the past, it's pretty apparent that ecology's allowed, or I should say, their prohibition of certain activities with respect to the allocation and the use and withdrawals of the water, there in like in the valley floor especially, where you could go drill a single hole in the ground and hit 300 gallons a minute if you wanted to pump it. But they wouldn't let you convert that into a public water system with any form of water right and serve the other 25 lots adjacent to you on both sides, even though you had the water, and instead required everybody to drill a separate well, everything creating yet another conduit into the water table, allowing more potential for contamination and who knows what else.
Exactly.
And at least if they'd allowed the public water system to start with, you know, people at that point with what they were saving probably wouldn't have minded too much putting meters on
Right.
So they would know exactly what they're taking out.
Yep.
But they didn't allow it then, and now look where we're at today, so. I will make sure, for the sake of discussion, it gets put on the Board of Health agenda. I won't be present, but I'll make sure it gets on the agenda.
Is Lori, down there today?
Not at this point in the day.
Okay.
She's been trying to get confirmation on a date to sit down and discuss budget.
Tomorrow. I know that's probably tight for Jim, so I'm gonna try to get it. Look at some real quick here. Probably if I went down there at 2:30. Can you find out if that works for her and see if it works for Jim?
I'm sure it'll work for her. She's supposed to be there all day tomorrow.
Okay.
Jimmy will be the one I need to call, but I can do that after the meeting.
Okay.
Actually, you could go, that's not gonna take that long. You could go earlier.
Well, if I'm sure, I don't know, that might actually take a while.
Oh,
That,
really?
that presentation for the DMO. It might take,
Oh,
and
yeah.
plus we gotta, look at the budget and make sure that.
You're looking at the
budget.
deal.
Well, I'll just figure 2:30.
Okay, it should be fairly smooth.
Yeah.
I mean,
I wanted to make
we're
sure he was there
pretty
for
much
that.
done with it.
During that
That's
period of
perfect.
time, I was hoping that he could be there.
I don't,
Yeah,
I don't discount that at all.
We're not even asking for more money
What's that?
Yeah.
for our budget.
What's that?
We're not asking for any more money in our budget. It's, we went out and shook trees and sold aluminum cans and stuff, and we plussed it up a touch.
Good. That's what I like to hear, because we minus ours up a bunch.
But he has some great reduction ideas when it comes to seeing. That's why we picked him.
Yeah.
Just so happen you weren't there.
I noticed, believe me, I noticed.
So
Yeah.
committee,
No, not really. It's just because
Yeah.
you're the budget king right now.
It's because you, yeah, it was, I heard, yeah, it's correct.
Yeah. There you
Because
go.
he had the experience from last year when he failed to show up for a meeting too.
Yeah.
He'll be the budget king when we go broke, too.
He's still the king.
Yeah. That's not gonna happen.
before we roll into our next subject, commissioners, anything else on this subject that we can pick up at this point? We kind of, I mean, it's, the second subject is related, and that was the question of the proposed amendment to the subdivision regulation regarding your enclosed areas in the Methow. I had the notice ginned up for November 19th, but I didn't submit it, because it kind of renders it all a little moot. You recall, the proposal was to have in the application materials, the letter from the Department of Ecology. The Department of Ecology isn't going to give you a letter now, so there's really no point in requiring one.
Yeah, catch 22. You change the code and the next day you get another letter for them and you start back at square one again.
There's some fluidity in the application of the rule, for sure, but, I mean, I can go ahead and set a hearing, we can talk about it if you wanna use that as part of the public outreach, but there's no point in amending the code as we had earlier envisioned it, cause they just won't give you the.
Well-
So if somebody walks in and says, hey, I wanna subdivide up here in a closed basin, what are you gonna say? Sorry, you
My
can't get water.
instructions to my crew is to not take the application. I mean, I can take their application and we can go through the exercise, but they have no water supply. The
Make
chance.
sure though that the crew understands, lets them know why they don't have any water supply.
Well, I have told them that, give them lay of the land as it exists at this particular point in time. If they want additional explanation, they're to give them to me.
Give them
Yeah,
the
here,
phone
here's,
number.
yeah, say Parks.
Pardon?
Give them Ecology's phone number.
Yeah.
Well, that would be.
That's what I would do.
Well, no, we'll get to that as we move through the conversation, but,
Well, you know, they can explain better
I'm
than
gonna
you
go
can.
try to.
what they're doing now at the front counter is when they come in, rather than taking the application and going through the normal review process. If it's in 48, they just pull up the parcel in question and lay it on the maps. And if it's in the restricted areas, there's no point taking the application if their proposal is to use a permit exempt well. Outside of the areas now consistent with our discussion, if it's close to the main stem, we'll take a look at it. If it's not, then it won't be a question of simply denying them, we'll suggest they wait until the maps have been revised.
So you will be able to, or your crew will be able to, when the people come in, look at it right then?
They can pull it up and lay it on those.
That was
basin
one
maps.
question we had, because we're not gonna take applications in the Methow until they've been to Perry's office, so.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Angie, you guys can pull up those
Yeah.
restricted just like you got here,
Right like this.
put the parcel on and that'll,
So if you do take their site analysis application, they'll know they're good to come back to me to turn in. No sense in having people turn in a building
No.
permit application, pay the plan review, have us do that work, not be able to get that approval and not be able to get any money back, I
Really a
mean.
Source of, yeah.
Tends to be a little contentious.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what have you been doing, with those lots that are partially included in the closed area?
I'm
You get
sorry?
Partial closure on a lot's got the line running through it.
Half
Have you
in, half
run
out.
into
half
that?
in, half out.
We haven't ran into it very much.
We did once though that I can think of. and
The
we
water
actually-
availability stuff. we
Yeah,
did.
we actually used their site, we made them give us a
Mhm.
site plan to decide where they were gonna put the well,
Let me guess.
and then, yeah.
Side of the line.
And then we relied on that. Now, what we did, I forget which one of the basins we encountered the other day, the basin actually crosses the river.
Where's that?
And, which one was it?
I don't remember.
That's an interesting one.
But one,
Who do you expect it to slosh over?
It's still connected.
I can't remember which one it was now.
Actually goes all the way across.
Well, if I recall correctly, wasn't that the one we were looking at the other day, Hubbard?
What was it?
Not that I remember,
No?
but
Oh, well, maybe I'm hallucinating then.
most of them go like right to.
Right to the river in terms of ecology's work. I think it was the Huck boundary that was,
Even the Huck boundaries.
all right, my mistake.
Quick question.
Whatever I was thinking of, I
See?
wasn't thinking of it.
Go ahead. Tuesday, the sixth, they can meet me up in Methow instead of me driving wherever I gotta drive. It would be later on in the afternoon, we have our budget work session,
Mhm.
and then just a general, other fund work sessions. But I would like to not have to go.
Yeah, no, that's fine, do it.
Okay.
Even if we have to come in the next day or whatever for the budget.
Well,
But our budget's not gonna be that.
Yeah, our budget's not gonna be that hard, and if you guys just have the questions and stuff and wanna do things, that's great.
Anything else on this subject, Commissioner?
Who's that? Nope,
Never a dull moment with water.
nope.
Who'd have
just
thought it
adds
was
to the
so exciting?
confusion.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, anything you would offer up for the good of the order?
Not at this time. Just
Look,
keep
Harry, I've
waiting
already
for the
drilled
next
my
thing.
well. Why can't I use it?
No, I understand that. We're waiting for
Are you
that.
role-playing now?
Like,
I mean, I know I'm gonna get the questions and I'm gonna
Oh,
defer
yeah.
them,
Right.
and I'll try not to laugh
Don't laugh.
about handing it to him and I get it off my desk, but, no, I mean, I completely understand a lot of those people's viewpoints up there, especially if they're looking at a phased approach to building their home or their dream. I think, well, we got a septic, now we got a well, and then ecology's stepping in behind the fact and saying, oh, we're not gonna honor them.
Well, that's what I've always been concerned about, and I know a lot of people say, well, just because you have a lot already created, you don't deserve anything, but, you know, I still look at that, and you can buy a lot, and if there's water there, and you had made plans for that, that's why I say, don't make any more lots till we know what we're doing here, and so some of these basins, because it puts just more people in that same position.
Right.
We don't want them to be in that position.
So I will leave, well, as I mentioned, I'll be gone from basically the 8th of next month until December. So I will leave my input for the board meeting and probably have JJ sit
Give us
in.
your number.
Thankfully, there's absolutely no service in either of the two locations I'll be occupying.
Satellite phone.
No. Oh, no.
Mule train.
The holding tank system, it's easy enough to check. I mean, to see if your water quality's being maintained and you haven't started to grow something funky for a science project in your own tank,
I
cause
thought you could drink
10,000
anything you
gallons,
want.
as you noted, lasts you a long time. So, it's not out of the question. We just kinda need to make sure we, I guess, square off all the corners when we,
Yeah,
if we decide to pursue or allow something of that nature in these closed areas, we probably need to figure out the plan on what we need to have done. And then Danny has to accept it as water adequacy, because right now, water adequacy does not constitute a gravity, or a holding tank of that type.
Well, and you know, again, it's a situation where you're talking about pre-existing lots that people have, they could have lost their water source, or, you know, or they had plans with their only little bit of money that they have in the whole world to live there, so I don't know. That's where subdivisions are very important to think, because if you don't have the water to serve the subdivision, what you're doing is setting people up for failure.
Right. And enforcement sites.
Yeah, that's what, can't keep up with it.
I think we're doing all right. We know, I keep some in reserve,
Okay.
just so there's always something to do.
Yeah. On those
Okay,
days,
thank
you
thank you,
don't-
gentlemen.
Thank you.
Next Tuesday.
Okay.
Commissioners, cannabis regulation, the planning commission met with your advisory committee. They're still in discussion, they have no recommendation for you at this time. There were a few subjects that the planning commission, I think, is developed some comfort with. Lighting is one or so other. One of the things that I wanted to share with the commissioners is some of the planning commission members have asked for me to create a staff report, a memo, if you will, taking the outstanding issues and kind of giving them some bright line parameters within which they can work. And I want to make sure that the planning commission understands the role of the advisory committee as you have assigned it to them. The last meeting, most of the non-industry, well, except for Mr. Zittle, most of the non-industry folk are just not engaged at this point. So we had all of the industry representatives, Mr. Zittle, at the workshop. And there's, as some of the representatives see this as kind of a negotiation between them and the planning commission, which really isn't their role in this, so I'm going to gently explain that at the point the planning commission has gathered the information they believe they need to gather, they should enter into their deliberations with the idea of coming up with a draft, which then, reminding everybody, will need to roll back, go out for public review, CPUB, all of that, come back to the planning commission, and then subsequently come to you. So there's plenty of opportunity for or non-industry representatives to weigh in on any draft before it comes to you for adoption. So I'll go ahead and generate that staff report for them.
No, it makes sense. I mean, it was a question of whether or not the committee would even assemble, so.
That, there was, and the planning committee, well, as you did, the planning commission kind of left it to them to come in and offer their input. Just kind of evolved from there, and probably there's some advantage
Reining it back
to
in.
getting that back between the lines. Well, the thing I want to make sure, I don't want the public perception to be that the planning commission, by extension you, or if you will, you, by extension, the planning commission, are in this negotiation with the industry to come up with something that suits their purpose and needs. That's really not the process that you have embarked on. Certainly gathering input from all sources is a valuable exercise. Negotiating for land use regulation isn't always the best approach, so.
It's almost close to will zone to suit.
I think I'd regurgitate every single meeting that the advisory committee is advisory. I don't care if there's one non-industry person there and 6 industry people, and they vote on something, they can't come back later if we and the planning commission change something and say, yeah, we voted on it. They need to be aware of the fact that their vote does not constitute rule.
And that was, in fact, early on in the process, as I do with
remind
it.
them of every meeting.
You know, as I do with any advisory committee that's convened for a particular purpose, they can certainly come up with their work product, but then begins the, by the time it works its way through the planning commission and back to you, it could look different
Yes.
from what they proposed, and that's just the nature,
Well, I mean, it's
the nature of the public process.
Came to us, we had a public hearing, and, we sent it back to address a couple or 3 things that didn't seem to be well covered. Just looking for more input that way, but in fact, in the end, we don't have to adopt what the planning commission sends us.
Right.
So,
The buck's here, to use a phrase.
right. But hopefully, we are able to respect their recommendation.
Well, and then, I mean, I suppose I, as a beholder, the magnitude of the change, but for the most part, the regulation was embraced, so.
And just in conversation with Mr. Zittel, I feel like that he does a pretty good job with representing the folks that have the concerns about the use in their neighborhood.
He's actually a passionate advocate for certain
But he's also,
perspectives.
I think he's also middle of the road.
He recognizes some areas are more perception than impact.
He's not
You
in
know,
it.
so-
Actually,
some-
and I respect, we're talking about an activity that happens in residential areas or areas that, there's conflict of land use that, not just potential, we're looking at it right now. And it's not easy to deal with it when there's already existing some of these uses that are problematic in the first place. So it's hard to stay away from that. You're making new rules, and it's hard to stay away from the fact that you already have pre-existing
Right.
uses out there.
Which actually comes up fairly regularly, the recognition that, and so far, the planning commission has still chosen not to embark on some kind of an amortization clause in terms of location there, or schedule, I should say. They embrace those parts that came out of the advisory committee and fencing, for instance, lighting, all of that, which operations have to comply with, and I think 2021 was the time frame they chose, of course, all new ones. They still are reluctant to reach back in terms of location, in terms of making by 2021 if they're not in a high-density area, for instance. They've still, and that was a specific decision. It's not that they haven't talked about it. They're just not prepared to go there at this point. So they're working on the other things in terms of what everyone should come into compliance with, and in terms of siting location, they're talking about new operations.
I think if we reach the point in our zoning, and it's beyond where we are today, that, designated areas a little more clearly in terms of residential type uses and what's allowed in them, instead of them being more like the minimum requirement district, it would make it easier. But we can't do that today, obviously.
Takes time. It's an evolutionary
But
process.
if we had zoning districts that really a little closer, it would clearly delineate what kind of uses we allow in those areas. It would behoove us to do that in a lot of areas, I think.
Well, we have, bring it up every once in a while, back when we morphed the minimum requirement district into R1, R5, and R20, essentially, we just walked the minimum requirement district over with different lot sizes. So
That's it.
for all intent and purposes, still the old minimum requirement district. You only have like 17 acres of industrial zoning throughout the county. Most of it was dealt with through a combination of permitted and conditional uses in the old minimum requirement district, which isn't always the best way to go. If there are areas that lend themselves to industrial development, zone them industrial, so people have that option of citing permit activities there, as opposed to using the conditional use permit to kind of, as a catch-all, to do a
Well,
site-specific
in
evaluation.
the industrial and commercial zoning, it still makes it a real challenge for a use that assimilates agriculture use. I mean,
Can, yeah.
I mean, it would be, when I was thinking about how taking agricultural use and try to restrict it to a commercial or industrial zone area, it wouldn't serve this county at all. So, that's what we're doing, we're dealing with a hybrid agricultural use.
So that's your update for your cannabis regulation. Any questions or observations? Next item then, we had our opening for Planner One, which is our regular budgeted position, which we didn't fill until about a week ago, I guess. I did not close it to occasion only, but as it worked out, a current employee was successful in that competitive process and will now move into the Planner One spot, leaving my administrative secretary position open. We did post, based on earlier discussion, we have, I believe Shar told me we have 14 applications. I have not begun the review.
14 applications?
It's a popular place.
Do they know
That they
I
have
know that
to,
they answer
that
to
they
you
have to
and
work
us.
for me? No, we did, I don't mention that any more than I have to. They all think they're working for. But at budget, have an opening, as I occasionally do. I would ask if you wish me to move forward.
I was talking to Perry the other day just about, since that happened and now this position's open, the possibilities of combining building and planning as far as that job position. We
Yeah.
talked about it a little bit.
Administrative clerk.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about it, thought it'd be a little bit difficult,
Yeah.
but it would be interesting just to see what Dan thought, about that.
The discussion of combining building and planning pops up every once in a while. And it certainly can be done. We did in Kittitas County. Other counties tend to combine building.
I was just looking at ways to save,
We would,
try to save money.
I-
But it's still good job.
and in our discussion the other day, the one thing that's a little bit of a wild card in our current situation is the building and planning departments in other counties tend to do building and planning. Or of course, the planning here does all sorts of fascinating things, as they pop up from time to time. So that's, trying to put all of that in one person might be a challenge. I mean, we worked Rocky to death from time to time with some of the special stuff. Not to say it can't be done. We will obey our orders, but it might take a little more deliberation if that's the direction that we want to go.
Yeah, and I don't know, I wanted to make sure I just put that out, that we had that conversation about it, to see.
Yeah, one thing I'd be a little bit concerned about is that, I mean, just because it's the administrative position and it's the one that meets folks often, I mean, you're in another office, even though it's down the hall, that partial approach be a problem. When we talk about combining, it's one thing, but to have.
Different locations.
If we just eliminated a position in my operation, I'd have been inclined to not fill the planner spot. Simply because that's, and it's not a big fiscal impact, but I always try to avoid the notion of out of classification duties. So in reverse as well as in the other direction. So if I have a whole bunch of planners doing the secretary's work, although some might argue that I need to revisit the classification of those positions, because in some respects, the administrative secretary does a much greater variety of interesting things than do the planners necessarily. But anyway, pushing that aside, if I have all the planners covering my administrative secretary's duties, theoretically,
Why do you have all that platform?
you know, it's a skewed, the equivalent, you know, if we cut enough planners, sooner or later, your better approach is to think about getting rid of me, because if I'm working short plats and site analysis, you know, you're paying a lot of money to have that level of work done. So if we're talking about that structure, we should throw the whole thing into the hopper.
That's the way I look at it. And, you know, for the administrative position like that, I see the front desk issue, that if somebody's coming in the room, the office, to deal with a building permit or a planning permit, I mean, there's the opportunity to have that person be a traffic cop and direct them in the right direction, but, it would have to be right there. Hello.
We made it work
So
in,
the discussion was out there, and I think that the kind of the consensus is that it probably won't work, so we can,
Well, and yeah.
we can drop it.
well, fair enough.
I just wanted to make sure that that discussion was out there.
I think it
Well,
would.
I got the,
never hurts to ask the
I think
question.
it'd be worth talking about if you had the desk.
Well, I mean, that, Commissioner, but we made it work in King County, because we created a permit center. So as we
Yeah.
were talking, literally, you come in either end of the building, and you had one long counter.
Oh,
And you could get to the other end of the counter and have all of the applications, all of the information, everything that you needed to do what you were going to
So
do,
for.
including environmental health. We had environmental health
Insane.
cited there too. So you're literally a one-stop shop. Public Works was there, building planning was there, environmental health was there, everybody.
So just stop
Was
in
it?
Chelan's planning building office, and I mean, there's a small version of that right there, and they have a workload, I mean, they got a lot going on there.
Yeah.
It's
That-
the same desk you walk in the door in their yard.
If we could set up a similar type of physical plant, then certainly it would lend itself. But
Then
I'll-
they go clear to East Wenatchee for health.
yeah,
I'll
good point.
I'll go ahead and move ahead then, at this point. Champerty Shores, let's skip over the comp plan for a moment. Champerty Shores, I don't have an update for you. I talked to Mr. Barker, we're in the process of getting the easement straightened around. I still have to go up and talk to Orville. What I'm kinda waiting for now is to see what direction he wants to go, whether he just wants to do his part of the project with the idea of reimbursement for the overage somewhere down the road, or what. So I'll go back around and touch bases with that. Columbia was working on a resolution for fee schedule. I thought she might want to introduce that to you this afternoon, but she may have made other arrangements, or you might see it tomorrow. Anyway, so I won't worry about that. Comp plan, let's talk the environmental checklist. I sent to you literally, but a couple hours. The draft I'm working on, it's not finished, I still need to gather some more numbers and those sorts of things, but I wanted you to see the direction that I'm going with this thing. What I'm trying to do, without making it essentially a summary of the environmental impact statement, what I'm trying to do is to identify those things which are gonna be significant issues, and where we already have policies that addresses it, I'm trying to identify that. Now, I got screwed up a little bit, I was using the, response to the Yakima Nation that I worked on, but I forgot that adding 4 pages of alternatives screwed up all of my citations, so now I gotta go back and redo all my citations. So anyway, a little glitch there along the way. But one of the things that I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, scoping will identify the significant issues. That's what scoping's supposed to do. We'll write the environmental impact statement around that. This will be one of your significant issues. It's come up every time we've gone out with any draft of the comprehensive plan. It came up in the zone code. It's come up all the way along the line. Now, we don't have mapped aquifer recharge areas. The comment evolves around those areas where you have your unconsolidated aquifers, where you have a lot of permeability in the soil, and it comes down to the impacts of on-site septic systems. Now, this was covered fairly heavily in one study that the Methow Valley Citizens Council submitted. I can't remember the name of the author now, but they were talking about it at a meeting some 2-3 months back. Tapman brought it up and wanted to know if everyone had read the study. Well, the study's been submitted for the last 2 or 3 years.
What was it?
Strauss.
Strauss?
Was that it?
Laura Strauss.
That sounds right. That sounds right.
Laura Strauss.
So anyway, without getting myself on a limb with a little technical jargon I'm not good at, essentially it comes down to the impact of density of on-site septic systems and their impact on aquifers. I think we should do some level of analysis, albeit within the budget that we have and the personnel that we have, to try to find a correlation or not in terms of our current circumstance. Now, my theory is the health district involved and go back, they do water tests every time you get a building permit, every time you approve a system, and see if in fact there's, if we're identifying instances we have contamination in the wells that are going to be traced back to on-site septic systems.
We have money in that one fund to do this.
Say, apparently there's some money around to maybe do that. Obviously, our first line concern is if in fact there's a problem, we ought to know about it. But more than if we don't look at it, then we fall under a legitimate criticism that we didn't look at it. That's the idea behind environmental review, a reasonably thorough discussion for the decision makers. So that's one area that I think at least put some effort into trying to determine if there is in fact an issue with the density of on-site systems and their impact to your drinking water aquifers. The other, of course.
So, let's back up just a minute.
Yes.
So, what happens if we don't find a correlate? I'm trying to think of the whole post-humic case, molecule for molecule, the fact that, you know, this water's in hydraulic continuity with this and all these other things. So if we were to find that kind of an issue and then we go down into the creek below and the same issue doesn't exist,
Well,
what do we do then?
to a point, 2 separate subjects. The post-humic case, when they were talking about molecule for molecule, they were talking about impact.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no such thing as an insignificant impact for senior water right for impairment. That's what we're talking about. I shouldn't say impact, I should say impairment. In this particular case, let's say, for example, that we do as much study as we can and we don't find well tests that are coming back negative. We don't find any water samples taken by anybody that shows the presence of fecal coliform or high nitrate levels or something. Then we've morphed the discussion from one of current impacts to speculative impacts. I mean, it's still a discussion. If you put a septic system in every half acre, will you develop a feature problem or no? But we've kind of taken it into a policy discussion now. If we actually find problems, then we already have a problem. And puts a greater point on the discussion. So more my point, I think we need to look. We need to be able to say that we took that comment and examined it. And then the results will be what they are. So before, our response has always been we don't have any mapped aquifers. which is technically true. Some argue, nah, you have some. None of them are done in fine detail. We could probably extrapolate some of the aquifers based upon the information we do have. But we can certainly do this level of analysis to see if there's a current problem. We can, if not, then we'll talk about the future through the course of our process. But I do think we need to look to the degree that we have the resources and expertise to do that.
So how does that play into the SEEP checklist?
SEEP list identifies that as something we need to do. So, taking it around full circle, I don't want to put anything into my work plan that you're just not interested in doing.
Are we gonna do it over here? So are we gonna do it countywide? Are we gonna check for fecal coliform?
Good question. I think we target it.
Yeah,
I mean,
you might be more inclined to do it on an audit style basis where you pick a place, it's the
I mean,
easiest place to do it.
And in part, we can use public health record. I mean, if there's an area that consistently comes up with bad tests, we can then lay it against our development pattern to see what kind of density you have in that area. We're looking for potential cause and effect.
How about if you were to take, and just go through the history of some of the water systems that ended up in that situation?
Good, well, Champerty Shores comes to mind.
Perry's Acreage, Champerty Shores, East Lake system, are all systems that have run into that. I don't know why did they just run out of water over there at, by Seaton's Grove? Or was that a contamination issue, do you remember?
It was, structural problem.
Okay, so that was probably more to do with their ability
Yeah.
to draw water.
The location of everything was because of the topography of where it was at was not it was resolved, as you remember. Remember Seaton Grove?
I couldn't remember if that was
Over by Elmer
contamination.
City.
It's over there by, Elmer City.
No, I'm drawing a complete blank.
No, that would have been
Creek.
11.
Right?
Okay.
Anyway,
But anyway, yeah.
there's some systems out there that, they're community water systems, right? They're probably Class B systems, that, ran into the same thing with Champerty Shores. So, I mean, I would be looking at some of those. And then the other is through health, of course, because when the banks are investigating a loan, then
I have a question for you. Let's say I were to take a look at every single Class B system that we've had in this county. Class B systems are regulated to be 11 or less. And only a small portion of them have problems. How do I treat that as density, as a density issue?
The idea behind SEPA, coming right out of the language of the statutes, is supposed to provide you a reasonably thorough discussion of the likely, probable, significant, and adverse impact.
well, let me answer that question the way I would think, is that I'm not speaking to it from a density standpoint, I'm speaking to it from a, full investigation, what's the soils like in that particular location? Soils and density have, the soils have everything to do with the density you're placing on the soil, so if you're going to do a subdivision, it's served by a water system, you're doing SEPA on it, there's a question about soils. And, it's just a little bit, and then you look at the soils study and say, wow, this doesn't, and in fact, I think there's even a section in the soil study that says this is good for septic systems. So you're doing that due diligence through that process.
What about if you're surrounded by irrigation and the irrigation is,
With nitrates or
well,
driven.
not nitrates, let's say no use of pesticides, chemicals, or anything, but the water's being applied at a rate that infiltrates. And I actually moves, fecal coliform or whatever through the soil.
What if?
I'm just trying to think of the, when you examine these things, where are you going to go with them to say, okay, this is now a policy? Because
Well, this doesn't dictate policy, this informs the policymaker. So if we do an analysis, spot check the Group B, Class A workbooks, whatever, and you don't find a high rate of of a bad test, some argue that density dictates the problem, others argue that if you follow your regulation on books, then the idea behind it is that takes care of the on-site effluent. Now you're the trier of fact. If you lend itself toward, if you lend credence to the idea that if you just follow your regulation, maintain your wellhead protection, all of those things, then you're okay, then your policy will be reflective of that. If in fact you find a whole bunch of bum tests out there, well, now we probably need to figure out why. We're just putting too many of them on the same patch of dirt. Other areas, we look for other causes, other areas with high irrigation rates or something. I mean, Champerty Shores, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Champerty Shores, when they did occasionally get a good test, it was generally when the irrigation was on, they couldn't get a good test. Well, okay. Was that because the septic systems weren't working, or was that because they was pumping so much water through irrigation that it was affecting the way the soils were able to break down the effluent, all the above?
I guess that's the question also. I mean, if we're just looking for the correlation between on-site septic systems and water quality in a particular area, a good study to do, because many of these circumstances that have arisen have been circumstantial here. Soils, there's the thing you were talking about, the water recharge that was happening. Go up and see, because that's a good, because there's, this clay layer that actually the water, when it recharges, tends to perch on it. And it'll lead you to believe you have a lot of water, in fact. And there's circumstances where that happened, and the water went away real quick after they broke into the water source. Brandon Beach, over on the other side up by the border, there was one where there was approved for development, and when they went to dig the foundation, it was all water purged from irrigation, presumably. There's a lot of irrigation that happens right there, and it all blew out into the lake, and there was no more water in the well. They proved water availability, and water availability went away within a few days. So that recharge thing is kind of an interesting thing when you get around those areas where there's a lot. So if you're just looking for that correlation, I think we might be spending a lot of time studying something that is really relative to a particular area and the soils on that area. And I don't know if it would help us to do that, to figure out what the correlation is between on-site systems and other ways. I mean, because again, you go to lakes and there's a clay layer there, and I would venture to say that because of that, and because of the way the water sits there, that septic systems would be affecting lake water quality when they fail. And when do they fail? When they fail. Yeah, how do you find out? So, not speaking for or against septic systems, I'm just saying that. So, some areas it wouldn't make as big a difference if they failed. Perry's acreage, I do believe, was probably a density issue. I'm just guessing that. And they ended up having to hook to a sewer system, but that was available. So I don't know. Recharge, the way I've addressed it in the past, and I think we did this in this the way it is in this comp plan, is that you're looking at the unconsolidated nature of the aquifers, and you find yourself looking at water quality being your focus. Because as far as aquifer recharge is concerned, and critical aquifer recharge, part of that is how the water gets down into the ground. And I suppose if we were putting up a lot of Walmarts in an area where that was an aquifer recharge area, it'd be a really big deal. Right now, we have a bunch of different means to protect water quality. So around the cities, they've looked at the flow of water and the permeability of it. You'll find the studies in their water comp plans. And basically what you're doing is looking for all the potential contamination in the area and discouraging, practices that would cause water contamination. I don't know if we're gonna get there on a on-site system study without a big study. I don't know, what do you guys think? You gonna get there? Because aquifer recharge areas, I think, have been commonly looked at as those areas where the streams flow. And the recharge is interacting with those streams. It's either going in the stream or going out of the stream.
So how do you address the question came up, the comment has come up about critical aquifer recharge areas.
Right.
So how do you address that comment? Or do you say we've already addressed it in the section that we put in?
Depends on how much money you can spend, I guess, because isn't that what they were doing up at the upper Methow, right? And that's why we had that fund.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty substantial, I believe. And what did they get out of that one, I wonder?
They found that there was no issues with water quality. The flowing aquifer.
So they could identify what kind of aquifer it was. It was based on drilling some wells. I saw another area, and I've embarked on a couple of these studies, but in Thurston County, they had problems with water contamination, and they had to try to understand the aquifer, so they drilled a bunch of wells. USGS did it, and then they made some cross-sections, created cross-sections of the whole area that they felt the aquifer existed in, and defined it. I know they kind of gave them a better look at what's under the ground, and not a perfect look either. But at least they understood a little. They were able to, like, yeah, we need a sewer system in this area. A town running 2,000 people, yeah, we need a sewer system in that town. But they were trying to understand the flow of the water, the depth of the water, and what kind of materials it is. And those aquifers tended to be a little more sole source natured, and ours aren't that way, so they're really harder to deal with. And so we concluded, I think you'll find a few comp plans around that say, generally, they run the course of surface water systems, and that's what we're dealing with when we're talking about the TCFS and the closed areas and all those things. So I don't know that density is still an issue.
Just gaining a lot of ground because he's
Sorry, guys, I think you got a mind.
So
for some
just
people.
sharing what I know about the subject, I mean, that's the way it's gone. But certainly looking at health records, failed systems, and when do you find out they're failed?
When
When you find out.
Yeah.
When you go get it,
Yeah.
but somebody wants to buy your property,
Yeah, you gotta
usually,
get it pumped.
or it smells real bad around your place, and then something happens, water surface, you have a problem. And then they go to get a permit. I mean, really, most of the time, some of them just sit there forever and fail, but they go to, so, to do one piece of a study. Go look at their records on failed systems and see where most of them are.
Why look at them on failed systems? Because if you knew that the system was failed, you may know that there's, why not just do a sampling around like you were talking about?
I was talking about drilling wells.
No, I mean, the health department, there are set like, for Group B systems and Group A systems,
Mhm.
you have to have yearly, I think monthly tests on a Group A and Group B.
Yes, you do. So you're checking the water quality to see if it's,
You're checking the water quality to see if the septic systems could be affecting the water quality.
you're
Is
checking the water quality to see if it's good water quality or bad, then you're gonna suspect something that causes the problem, right?
Right.
And usually it's probably nitrate's the most common test that you have to do.
I never call for them, you have to do them.
Well, coliform is an easy one, but nitrates is one that will show up both whether you're having septic problems and if you're having contamination from agriculture.
We're not talking about contamination from agriculture necessarily, we're talking about density of building.
Okay,
The
the
whole-
purpose of the septic, the purpose of is just to see the correlation between on-site systems and water contamination.
Because that was the basis for
The basis for aquifer recharge area is critical aquifer recharge. Yes, areas that are recharged and how you might affect that recharging effect, and the potential for water contamination due to the minimal recharge that you probably get in a local area.
I mean, I've seen one, they fence them out. I've seen one I actually looked at the sign,
Right.
what it said. It was a critical walk for recharge area, and there's a big
Right.
chain link fence around it,
That's correct.
right? So nobody can get in, it's just like when you go hunting down there in the blues,
Oh, at the watershed?
at the watershed.
Right.
That's probably considered a critical walk for recharge area.
Yeah,
So you only get one person that can go in with you and go hunt, because they don't want a bunch of
right.
Well,
horse poop.
And so it's not just the
all-
contamination, they protect those areas against development, so you're not affecting the recharging effect of the aquifer either.
Mhm.
So, there's coastal communities where common you see that.
So I guess though, back to,
Yeah,
Um,
it's like I was gonna, just like,
that-
like
right,
Aqua.
yeah, and Santa Creek,
That is strictly dependent on the upper and lower reservoir pumping on it. That's the only reason that aquifer exists. So,
and as that continues, there's a lot of, I mean, what we're doing though is looking at, developing the comp plan and trying to look at development, land use, right? So, I understand what you're saying.
what's it say now?
actually, you know what I suggest?
As we have it right now.
You have a new section on aquifer recharge areas. You have language about reliance on regulation for on-site septic and that sort of thing. There's no cross tie. There's no cross tie at this point, in my opinion, between on-site septic
So that's where you're trying to get to.
and water quality, and more of the point, keep in mind, we have two processes where we've embarked on. One is the review of the comprehensive plan, and the other is the required environmental review. The purpose of the environmental review is to examine your significant issues. This will be a significant issue. I know it will be a significant issue. That's going to come in. It comes in every time. Water quality, generally under the banner of aquifer recharge, morphing down into groundwater, both quality and quantity. Both tie back in many respects to, that's the assertion, agree or no, to density. The more people you have pulling out of the groundwater, the more impact it has on groundwater supply. Conversely, the more people you have putting effluent back into the water table, if you will, the more impact it has on groundwater quality. My observation is, other than, studies and kind of anecdotal tales and these sorts of things,
That's what
I don't have a folder that says out of 250 well tests, 2 came back with high nitrate levels, or 249 came back with high nitrate levels. I don't have that information. If I'm going to gather that information, I might as well identify in the checklist as something we're going to review. It'll also come up in the scoping documents, we may end up having to do it anyway, but I was gonna be preemptive if the commissioners are on board.
How about if we were to do this, just for they call it, is that if we're gonna talk about this subject, I think that we ought to read at least ecology's critical aquifer recharge area guidance document. So that then we can go,
Okay.
what, because it's addressing what you're trying to address in the Growth Management Act under designated for recharge areas. So what do you think?
We can get that too.
It's online.
I'm reading it, I'm actually reading it right now,
Okay,
or parts
so
of it.
we'll give you 10 more minutes.
Yeah, right. That'll get me through that.
But I suggest that because, you know, when I first had to deal with it, that's what I had to do, and then it didn't make it a whole lot easier, but at least I understood what the heck the goal was for the act. And then what you're proposing might fall right into place or not for other issues.
While you're thinking about that, we're gonna end up doing this anyway, at least in 49. And that's just under the banner of how much you got. We're gonna have to do our water budget in 49. My theory is, whatever we come up with for that, we should create a model that we can apply throughout the county with the idea of trying to, or the objective, looking at the middle range of the OFM population projections, we're going to absorb 2,500 new households by 2040. So, if we figure out how much water we're going to decide each household uses, and we already have we have the aspect study, we have DOE's guidance. We can put a finer point on that discussion and essentially project our water budget. Now the crew is putting together, actually freshening up, we did it for the zone code EIS, the building permits, how many building permits we're drawing and where they are, where they're applying to build. Obviously, we can lay that against the ones that are in water systems. We can lay that against the ones that are in city expansion areas. We can do all that finer level of analysis. The idea being, eventually, we come up with our groundwater budget. So that's our measurable impact. Do we need 1,000 more gallons a year, or 500 million gallons more a year, or whatever, and where it's going to be. Obviously, that going right back to the D word, density. So
Another thing to look at that's kind of informative is those water plans for the cities and towns. They're required to have a wellhead protection plan. And that wellhead protection plan gives you another kind of a view of what you're managing for. So,
But that's in your municipality, we still have a wellhead protection in the county.
yeah, around various wellheads, yes. Yeah, they have, you know, an extensive study they had to do. I mean, I say extensive, but, you know, evergreen rural water typically came in and did all of them. But they looked at permeability and how fast water transmits underground in those general vicinities. And then on top of that, then they had a list of those potential contaminators that could have spills or something like that in the area. And really they did, you know, a simple analysis of how fast that stuff moves through the ground. And it gives you an idea, at least in those areas, what the permeability is and what's going on there. I mean, if you go to South Oroville where their wells are, the water's really close to the surface. It's in the floodplain. You know, you got a pretty good idea on what's going on there, and that tells you how fast the water. All it is to give you an example of what kind of things are being looked at in those areas with higher densities.
other thing, and it's always been, I don't know, it always comes up, impact of roads. My humble opinion, there's never really been a correlation between either the evolved settlement pattern or the desired settlement pattern and our transportation element. They're almost, again, my opinion, they almost occur in isolation. Public Works talks about the transportation grid and the various levels of service classifications and all of that. We talk about density and all these things, but there really isn't. And then you have policy that ties the ability of the transportation grid to serve existing and increasing population. But we never really get to the point where we say, and over here, it's not gonna work unless you upgrade the roads. Or over here, you have plenty of road system to deal with any projected level of population growth. And of course, right now, in your large lot subdivision, de facto, your exempt segregation, all it says about roads is if you put a disclaimer that says the county's not responsible for the roads, you don't have to do anything. So, I would think some level of analysis in terms of your transportation grid and its ability to support the population growth we project, and more importantly, where might be in order.
So, everybody's read our transportation plan as it exists today, right?
Pardon?
Everybody's read our transportation plan as it exists today?
I haven't read it today, no.
As it exists today. Not today, but I mean, you know, because we have one that was recently prepared. It's well worth taking a look at and seeing how far it goes for us. Because, you know, it has even a few tasks in there that need to be done, and it relates to land use. I mean, the transportation plan wouldn't be worth anything if it didn't. But I think it's a good place to see if it's gonna serve us. And then what, we'd have to use it.
To kind of take my observations to the next level, we're doing the environmental checklist, we'll go through scoping, we'll identify our significant issues. But one of the purposes of the environmental impact statement can be to identify mitigations. If you have a likely, probable, significant adverse impact under aquifer recharge, say the final environmental impact statement can direct that certain activities take. You need a more intensive study or something along those lines. It could do that, same as the transportation element. If, for instance, there seems to be a disconnect between the road standards and your subdivision regulation and zone code, the FEIS can certainly direct a concurrency analysis to see what needs to be done in terms of the road standards or whichever, to bring everything back into compatibility, back into compliance. Let me go ahead and tip my hand here a bit. I had this discussion some few years back within special counsel, who characterized this as all busy work for planners. I'm not looking for busy work. I want you to know that. I managed to fill my day quite nicely with what I had to do right now. What I'm trying to do is get ahead of what I anticipate will be the issues upon which we will certainly come under critical litigation at some point in the future. The amelioration for that is to make sure we can put our hand on the Bible, so to speak, and say we've had a reason of those impacts, and the decision makers took that into account when you made your decision.
Where would you, if you were to look at somebody's comprehensive plan, they've already, people find their environmental checklist?
If they did one, we can check with Chelan. Why don't we check with Chelan? The Yakima Nation is very impressed with Chelan County's comprehensive plan. I mean, it's voluminous compared to yours, but we can see if they did a checklist. You're not required to do a checklist. Stipulate to a determination of significance. The idea being scoping then essentially provides the structured discussion that the checklist would otherwise provide. I've elected to do one mostly because we were heavily criticized before for not doing one, and I don't know that I need to spend my time defending doing one as opposed to just doing one. If they wanna argue it wasn't adequate, so be it, but at least we can do one and frame the discussion.
I think that we should rely heavily upon answering the questions in the checklist and providing a transportation element to the comp plan by using the plan that was done and it's projected to service to 2040. It's not the most complete. It's a 2040 regional transportation plan for the Okanogan region. And it goes through a variety of transportation-related issues, fairly real current.
Well, we should have, the one that's in your current draft is the one that Public Works submitted to us
Yes,
a few years ago now.
yes.
So we should update that.
And given what it looks like today, I don't see that as being a hugely difficult task, the way it was written. And it has a 2017 reference in it. That 2017 reference is the establishment of the OCOG and the RTPO being created.
We'll get that from Public Works and walk it in.
There's a, yeah, it says they submitted it as a review draft.
I'm sorry.
Did they submit it as a review draft? We never adopted the plan.
No, I don't know, not that I'm aware of.
It hasn't been around since, I mean, it wasn't around, it wasn't finished before we got involved.
The transportation element that's currently in the 2014 plan, and that's the same version in the two alternatives, was a hybrid of the transportation plan that Public Works had adopted in 2012. Maybe earlier than that, I don't remember now.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Yeah,
and you recall, that was one of the criticism, the transportation plan that they submitted in the first iteration of the comp plan was hundreds and hundreds of pages. And, yeah, that created some uproar, so they essentially scoured it for the elements that would lend itself to the creation of a transportation element for purposes of the Planning Enabling Act, so.
Right, so there's been two plans that were prepared since then.
Okay, all right.
One was prepared, kind of a hurry-up plan so that we qualified for something in the county. That was done by Highlands Associates.
Okay.
And that was done, it was a compliance plan, and I call them anyway. It was done to comply with something. And then the other one is this 2017.
Would that have been to do with some of the grant funding
Yeah, I
coming
think
through Public Works?
I think it was, but yeah. And it dealt with the RTPO too. And so the money came from the RTPO, and through went together.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, we used RTPO money, and that was even right at the transition to a new RTPO. And that was done by a CJ Alliance. And that was, and it has a 2017 reference in it, so that's pretty recent. That's last year's.
Well, I'll
And it's-
coordinate with Public Works again and have them run their thumb down the transportation element, see if it should be.
And it's not hundreds of pages, so we're lucky.
Fair enough, so it should be, see if they want to update that then.
Yeah, I mean,
But it's,
Yeah.
I mean, even with a new transportation plan, and I may be wrong, but I still suggest there's a weak link in terms of tying that transportation plan back to your land use
there's
regulation.
very little link at all, but there is a link. So, I agree with you 100%. The one missing piece of it too is that, so you take the goals and strategies that are in it, because they're fairly general, and then they need to be applied to some projects of significance for us, and then the standards for the road standards, roads need to be updated, and I think we need to do. But it needs some project projects out there, and I've had people call me, and they say, there's this part of the road that we're really concerned about, what's the county doing with it? The responses they get from the area supervisors are, we've been wanting to address that issue, but we haven't had the funding, and so it didn't turn out as a priority, so we don't have that. We get our 6-year improvement plan. That doesn't tell us a whole lot, it's just saying that we're gonna typically do some road work and do seal coats on various roads, maintenance things. But those things out there that we plan to do, there's fairly major, even, I call it gyms, but the Hubbard Road situation, it really should be in that 20 plan, we should have some updates that show these projects that need focus. And if we have those and we need funding somewhere, you can put it down there, and you didn't create this idea for a grant-funded project that wasn't in a plan for X number of years. It makes your case, it makes it so you can get dollars. So that's part of the reason, and that tie-in with the land use is ever so critical. And it goes clear down to that primitive road study, all the way from the top to the bottom. And it prepares us to respond to the stuff that comes at us that we're not prepared to respond to, because we don't know what we got, you know, as far as road inventory is concerned. So soapbox is over, but that's really critical to tying that transportation plan into the comp plan.
Well, what I'll do is say I'm on the home stretch now, so I'll finish up the checklist. I'll take our conversation and incorporate it into the rest of my work with the checklist and send it back out to you. I'll check with Public Works and have them double check the transportation element and see if they need to freshen that up. Other than that,
Do you have a copy of it? Do you guys have a copy of that?
The 1996 version?
No, 2017.
Yeah, I think I got it from when we were doing the OCOG stuff.
Well, I'll send it to you.
Pardon me?
I'll send it to you anyway.
Yeah.
my goal is to initiate scoping sometime in November, which should be an attainable goal, unless the commissioners want some additional time to on it. In which case I'm-
Scoping in when? Just in December, you say?
Well, initiate in November. The idea, we'll get through scoping somewhere in December, and then we can begin to structure the environmental impact statement.
Did you intend to have a initial scoping?
I'm sorry, Commissioner, to unfold, we can certainly do that.
It's an excuse to have a party.
Pardon?
It's an excuse to have a party.
Well, that's true.
What was that?
Hubbard's down for any celebration,
Oh,
we
right.
can get everyone together and,
Celebrate where we've been, where we're going.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just, I thought that it would be a good public input time when you put out a scoping document. I'm used to seeing public.
I mean, it wouldn't hurt if we could pull it together. I'll create essentially a memo, a staff report explaining what the scoping process is. A lot of times there's that confusion in that people kind of turn the scoping comment period into the criticism of an environmental impact statement that doesn't exist.
Right.
As opposed to explaining what they think we should look at and why. They tell you didn't look at animals hard enough. Well, you're not in the checklist. That's not the analysis. That's simply the structure of the discussion.
Yeah, and it needs to be explained. I mean, what what should be looked at?
Say, what is scoping all about? What scoping is all about is to tell us what we should be looking at. What are the important issues? Well, I mean,
I don't know if there, I mean, that's something I throw out to you guys too, is that, do you think we need to have a scoping meeting? Because, I don't know, we're in a time where we were doing some comp plan revisions and we've not had a, and I don't want it to turn into a hearing kind of a situation, of course, where we're having criticism of the current planning effort or the last planning. It was more to what do you think that we need to be looking at in our comp plan update? It's, the answers are there, but the public hasn't given us their view of it.
I mean, to me, the value in doing that would be not so much to begin to give people a chance to explain to them what you need to hear. This is what scoping is for.
This is what we're doing right now.
This is what we're doing right now. So it could almost coincide with the release of the draft. And the scoping memo. And then essentially, you just be a face-to-face, okay, now what are we doing? Where do we go from here? Walk through timeline, that sort of thing.
You're referring to just a informational meeting, not a public hearing?
Yep, no, wouldn't be about, nothing to take testimony on at this point.
Yeah.
Strictly
Because
be
otherwise it'd turn into
essentially a Q&A.
We'll get there sooner or later.
Well, I mean, you know, even if it does, that's one thing, but the danger is people think they're now giving you their comments on a comprehensive plan they haven't seen yet.
Right.
And, you know,
that's what I was gonna say.
and that's not the purpose. The purpose is to just explain, okay, here's where we're at in the review. Where we are at.
Elements of the comprehensive plan.
Where we
Here's
are
what you
at,
can find.
review comprehensive plan, what you believe the issues are that lend themselves to reviewing the environmental impact statement. Groundwater supply will come up, as one example.
And
I
it's,
think you're taking away all my property rights is not an environmental issue. That may be a perfectly legitimate and important comment somewhere down the line as they talk about the comprehensive plan itself. Property rights. But that's not a significant environmental issue.
and there's some things that we've addressed here recently that I think need to be put out there. Is here's the scope that we have today for the comp plan. Lots of folks, I'm sure, out there going, what are they doing with the comp plan?
Oh, likely, yeah, quite likely. It's been
Yeah.
a long process.
It may be the opportunity to dispel myths about where we're going here. Anyway,
Well, why don't I put together what I would consider an agenda for such a thing for the commissioners to look at? And see if we wanna put the resources to it.
yeah, because we get criticized for not doing what we're doing, and that's why you're doing the checklist. And we also get criticized for the SEPA that you're supposed to have initial and ongoing public involvement. So,
True.
Can we barbecue? Just kidding.
I was looking for the party.
yeah, well.
I said we could barbecue.
You mean feed the people, so subdue them a bit,
Right? People are happier when they're not hungry.
right, when they're eating together.
Anything else on the comprehensive plan today, Commissioner? That is your agenda. Anything for me? Very good.